Sometimes it's the little touches which lift your artwork from, yeah, okay, to wow. And being able to add realistic dewdrops to a flower or water drops on the back of a bird, it's one of those little touches, and they're really straightforward to do. So this week I wanted to show you how to paint realistic water drops in watercolour, and we'll go through a few different techniques which will either let you plan them or add them on at the end. My name's Liz Chaderton. I'm a professional watercolour artist based in Berkshire, and every week I try and bring you a tip or trick or technique that I wish I'd known about ages ago. And this week it's dewdrops. Well, I just wanted to show you, say, this picture. I mean, it's just, oh, got a hair on it. Picture of a couple of leaves, which so what, but actually the water drops just give a little bit of interest. So they can be really useful on things like flowers and leaves and sort of natural studies. But more than that, they really teach us about tones. So if we look at this little study sheet, these are all real exercises in observation and understanding of tones and what's happening in our painting. So they are incredibly useful as an exercise for making you in control of your watercolour. I've been practicing a few and thinking of different ways of doing it to come up with some alternatives. The first thing is just to think of the anatomy of that water drop when it's sitting on whatever surface it is. And the first thing, if you really look at it, is to realise that it is usually lighter than the surroundings, just because of the way that the light gets reflected. And say the light is coming from above there or from the top, it somewhat counterintuitively, this end nearest the light is actually the darkest point. So you have some light, say, reflected in the edge, but then it is dark going towards light at the bottom. So I think what happens is that light passes through, some acted on the surface, which gives us those bright highlights, but then it just passes through the edge of the drop and sort of bounces off the back end of it. So that's why this bit is lighter, that's darker. And because it bounces off there, we actually get a shadow on the far end of the drop, which might be quite small if the light is coming from more above, but say the light is low down, it's going to be longer. So you get that shadow. And sometimes in the shadow, some of the light passes through, so the shadow is not uniform, and you actually get a pale area in the shadow. And the other thing, you know, this is reflecting everything that's round it. So the water drop isn't just see-through or even sort of grey, it's picking up all the colours around it. So if there's a bright coloured object over here to the right, you might see some of that colour reflected in it. Let's start by just doing a dewdrop on the white surface, and you can use whatever colour. So this is a super way of using up paint in a palette, and I'm using quite a small brush here. Again, you'll need to sort of fix the size of your brush to the size of your water drop. So what I'm going to do is paint round those little highlights, decide where I want them, whether I want 1 or 2, and paint round that highlight. Then with clean water, I'm going to come in and fade that away. Now, there was quite a lot of pigment on there. So let's just get that faded away, and we're going to have to pull some of that out of the bottom here, because say that was quite a lot of pigment on there. So we've gone that dark through to light. If you want it really light, you can even pull out a bit with a bit of kitchen towel. Just make sure that we've got nice gradation. Big advantage of that is that it actually dries that edge, so we can get that shadow in without waiting. So we come down to the bottom outside of the dewdrop and just put in our little crescent of shadow. And we do want that edge to be pretty crisp. So the fact that that wasn't quite dry and it's bled in there could be a bit of a problem, but we can just pull that out and I think we'll be fine. That in essence is your drop of water, but it's going to be pretty rare that it's just on a white background. So let's think of different ways that we could do this. Could put in our background and we could use a brush or a piece of kitchen towel, whichever's easiest, to lighten where our dewdrop's going to go. And we'll need to let that dry. So that would be option 1 on a coloured background. Option 2 could be that we just paint round our dewdrop and leave it totally white. So there's our background. Just pull that colour away and we'll let that dry. So these lovely crisp highlights are really part of the sparkle of the dewdrop, and we're going to struggle here to pull them out. So what we could do, and let's just draw a dewdrop here. What we could do is use some masking fluid and actually pop them in. Let's try and keep them fairly fine. Let that dry and then put the background on. We could just put a background in, and rather than trying to lift it out while it's damp, we can let it dry and lift it out at that point. So let me let all those things dry and then we'll come back to them. So let's start with this area that we left totally white. This is probably sort of the closest to the one that we just did on white paper, because what we'll do is exactly the same process. So we start by leaving those little white highlights that we see at the edge, and then we can use clean water to fade it away to that lighter edge at the bottom. Just like that. I need to let that dry before putting on the outside shadow. Now this one, if you remember, was where we'd sort of lifted it while it was damp. I'm a little concerned because I did the background very dark there, so getting those highlights to really show up might be a little bit challenging. But I'm just going to do the same there and fade it down to the bottom. Now the bottom here, the tones of the water droplet and the surrounds are really quite similar, so I'm going to use a damp flat brush to try and lift more of that pigment, really lighten up that bottom segment, and I think that will work. Yeah, that's better, isn't it? Just get a better contrast there. Again, I'm going to let that dry before putting the outside shadow on. Now this one, if you remember, we'd put the masking fluid on to preserve those highlights. So I'm going to go through exactly the same process, putting on dark paint and then using a damp brush to pull it down and get a nice gradation to the bottom. And again, that's quite dark at the bottom, so the tone is not, I haven't got a good contrast of tone. So I am going to use that damp brush to scrub away a little of the colour and get a better gradation. And then the final one here, we just painted the background, and at this point we actually need to lift out some colour. So I'm just putting in that circle so I know where I'm lifting out. I can lift out some colour there, and I am going to leave those highlights at the top, but I'm going to have to go back in with white at the end to make those sparkle. Pull that down. So just trying to get everything nice and smooth, because there won't be any sort of hard edges in those water drops, will there? Good, those are dry now. So this was where we'd left the white circle. I'm just going to tidy up a few of those edges because that wasn't brilliant. Just smooth that round. You need to add in that shadow, the cast shadow. I'm going to make it quite long because I want to show you where sometimes you can get some light into that cast shadow, if you remember. So I'm making it long, the light is quite low coming down, and then I'm going to use my short flat brush to pull out just a little soft area here. And you could make it far more hard edged if you want to, but I think as just a soft light there is rather nice. You know, if you look back and think, oh, I haven't got enough contrast, you can always go back in and just layer it up and build that tone if you want. Something like that. And that's our first water droplet fully done. So over here, again, we can come round with our concentrated colour. If we were just doing a small shadow, we might just leave it like that, but actually we're going to do it slightly bigger, so we've got that space for a bit of variation. Use our the right end of our brush and can just pull out a bit more if we want to. So this one we can now remove our masking fluid, and you can see how bright those highlights are, and that'll give us a good contrast with the highlights where we've either just painted round or where there's been some colour left underneath. So again, just pulling out a little bit of that, and then this was the final one where we pulled out that colour once it was dry. Let's get our shadow in there. something like that, and again pulling out a little bit of that. It's almost like a triangular light there. If you've used masking fluid and maybe it's a bit blobby, which it always is, you can always go back in and just tighten up those highlights. While the shadow's damp, you can always put in a bit more pigment. And say you didn't pull out enough of that middle sort of lighter area in the shadow, you can always pull that out, or use a damp brush once it's fully dry to get there. Let's look what we've got. So here, just on the white paper, we've got really lovely bright highlights. Where we left the circle and then painted it, we've got really bright highlights. Where we've masked it, really bright highlights. However, where we lifted out when it was wet and where we lifted out after it was dry, we've got quite muted highlights, which might be fine. Or we can go back in and use an opaque white pen, or indeed some white gouache, and pop those bright highlights in. That's a jelly roll pen. Finding an opaque white pen is quite a tricky thing. But can you see that just brightens the highlight probably enough? You can even pop in an extra one if you want. That just gives a little bit more of a ping to it. Say you'd used a very staining colour and it had been really difficult to lift out some to the light area here. You could of course use a little bit of white gouache, and I'm just going to put it in the lid because this is dried up dreadfully. I'll add some clean water when I finish filming this. But you could always go, say, to the light area and actually lighten it up slightly. I think it's better if you don't do that. Simply it will look better because you can always see where you've put white paint on top. But you know, that's your decision, and you can do it in a subtle way so that it doesn't look too obvious. Now if you're doing them, say, on a leaf or a flower petal or whatever you're doing them on, there will be some added complications of the fact that the background isn't just one colour. You might see the veins of leaves going through them. And what you need to do is really, really observe, because you can see the distortions. Just as a pair of spectacles distort the person's face, this is acting like a little lens, and it'll distort the veins and the things underneath. So observe and paint what you see, not what you know, and you're not going to go far wrong.